I think you've got some paranormal phenomena. Okay, um, I've experienced some of that myself. I've experienced some of that myself.
I've experienced some of that myself.
Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and I'm very, very excited because along with me today, as you can see, is one of the top resurrection scholars in the world. And there's just two or three of those guys at the top. And he's one of them. Dr. Mike Licona of Houston Baptist University. I am so excited, honored, and pleased to have you here again, my friend. Welcome.
Thanks, Braxton. It's great to be with you, brother. I love you, my friend.
Yeah, well, we've been friends for many years, and we've traveled together, spent time together in and outside of the United States, and it's always been such a blessing to me. And I've always tried to help out younger apologists coming along where I can, because that's what you did for me, and that was very meaningful. But to get right to the point, you're here today because we're going to talk about some interesting things that you brought up in a debate several years ago that were kind of surprising to some people who follow you. And I think that these are relevant things to talk about, things that some people might think of as paranormal. But before we get to that, Mike, is there anything that you're doing, working on, or that is available that you would like to really promote, push? We're going to have those links in the description, so feel free to just talk about that for a minute.
Well, there's a number of things. Like we have a YouTube channel, Mike Licona, type there. We've got over 400 videos. We're also on AP315, which is spearheaded by Kurt Jarris. We have some videos there, so we can't be canceled.
Yeah.
And we're adding a bunch more videos there. I'm working on a pop level book of my 2017 book on gospel differences. I hope to have that done here really soon, wrap that up, and hopefully that'll be out in the fall of 2023. I'd mentioned HBU, but you're president of Trinity, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to do that. So we'll just
it's fine. Hey, listen, we do, there are many people who have gone to Trinity and have also gone to HBU. There have been at least a couple of students who've gone from Trinity to HBU. And my view about this is just that, hey, we're serving the kingdom, and there are things that there are people that you're going to reach and educate there that we're not here. So praise God. And we have nothing but respect for HBU.
Well, I appreciate that. So, and I respect what you're doing up there too.
Well, good. Well, Mike, so let me just set the stage by saying that several years ago, in fact, the first time that I ever saw you debate live was in Austin, Texas, at the Unapologetics Conference put on by Texas Baptist with Leighton Flowers and now Eric Hernandez, and you were debating Matt Dillahunty. Now, subsequently, I debated Matt Dillahunty at the same conference in another city, but I hadn't yet, and so I was watching you debate him. And everybody knows your deal, Mike. You're going to talk about the resurrection. That's your thing. Then it became the Gospels, but the Gospels and the resurrection, that goes together really well. And we've heard you talk about that many, many times. And this debate was different. And this debate was different because it seems that you began by establishing the supernatural before moving on to the resurrection. And you did that in an interesting way. So I'm just going to let you explain what was going through your head or why you find those kind of things compelling.
Yeah, I thought I'd do something a little differently. Now I had done that at least one time prior to my debate with Matt. I did it in my debate with Matthew McCormick, an atheist philosophy professor at where is it? University of California up in I want to say San Francisco, but that may not be it. I forgot where it was. It was a good time. That's on our YouTube channel. And I brought up some of the paranormal phenomena there. I figured, atheism doesn't think that there's any kind of supernatural or spiritual dimension, but there's a lot of evidence, some decent evidence for a spiritual or supernatural dimension, however you want to call it. We'll just call it a spiritual dimension, I suppose. And so why not give it? Yeah, some people may think you're a little quacky from doing it, but hey, that's just because they haven't experienced it. Once you experience it, you know that atheism is false. Um, and there's enough people out there who have experienced the spiritual dimension of reality. And when it was going to be in Austin, I had heard, whether it's true or not, I had heard that that's like a Wiccan capital. And so I figured, okay, well, they're familiar with the spiritual down there. So I'm probably pretty safe to bring it up.
Yeah.
No. No, I mean, I got clobbered by Christians. There was a pastor who attended that debate who said that, emailed me and said that I should never debate again. Because he and some of the church members who had attended that debate were just wanting me to use scripture. And the fact is I brought in a number of evidences of a spiritual dimension of reality. And I figured, you know what? I'm going to do that spend some more time on that rather than typical arguments for God's existence and spice this up a little bit. I mean, after all, this is, I believe, legitimate evidence. So why not use it?
So two things I want to say about that, Mike, that I've always wanted to say, and I probably have said, but here on this video, one is that I've always put you, so almost nobody cares about apologetic methodology, about arguing about what apologetic methodology to use and all that, except for people who are apologetics geeks, and this is all they think about. And the thing is, there's a book from Zondervan's Counterpoint series, 5 Views on Apologetics, and it has 5 different views that are also in Avery Dulles' History of Apologetics. These are commonly used ideas. You have classical, which is like your William Lane Craig, showing that God exists and then showing that God raised Jesus from the dead. You have your evidential, which is where I would have put you and Gary Habermas, where and maybe N.T. Wright, where you're basically just arguing for the resurrection or divinity of Jesus without arguing for God's existence using scientific and philosophical arguments. Then you have like your cumulative case, presuppositionalist, reformed epistemology. But those two, and often people like you and Craig would be lumped together in the category of evidentialist in a certain sense, that you're providing evidences, external evidences on which people can trust and believe. But you kind of made yourself into a classical apologist in this debate, because though you may not have been arguing directly for God's existence, you were arguing for the supernatural. And if the supernatural is established, obviously that increases your reasons to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, because there's a supernatural force at work. So I found that interesting. And then the other thing is, you and I were on a show a couple of years ago or a year ago, something like that, together, and it got cut off in the middle of it, and we had to reschedule that show. And you had already during the live show said something about these paranormal things that you're going to talk about, and but we got cut off, and so I talked to the host of that show about it, and I said, "Hey, by the way," I said, "I don't know if if you don't want him to talk about that paranormal stuff, you better say something." And he said, "No." He said, "Actually, I'll tell you what I like about it." He said, "The high-minded philosophical types might think that stuff is embarrassing to bring up. But the everyday person is like, yeah, you can say science explains all this and nature is all there is. Let me tell you what happened to me 3 years ago," that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think there is strength in this, and it shouldn't be dismissed so easily.
There's an atheist who sent me an email a few days after that debate and said, "Hey, I've experienced some of that demonic kind of stuff too." And I said to him, "Does that fit in with your worldview?" He says, "Well, no, it doesn't, but it still spooks me to this very day." And so I challenged him. I said, you ought to really give it some serious consideration. You have experienced this. And if there is a demonic element to reality, there is light in Jesus who has overcome the evil one.
Amen.
Anyway, yeah, I think it's important to look at this. Back in the first century, of course, with Jesus, I mean, he's expelling demons. Now, I've never expelled a demon. I don't know that I've ever seen a demon-possessed person. People have in other countries, in third world countries. But, I mean, this stuff is real. Talk to Craig Keener, This stuff is real. It happens.
Well, we Westerners are the weirdos. We've got this notion that science has explained everything, that naturalism is all there is. And even Bible-thumping Christians absorb a certain amount of that from the culture, such that when you talk about someone experiencing some sort of a demonic attack, there's a roll of the eyes, even for Christians, but then they don't have any trouble on Sunday looking at the Bible where it's talking about Jesus casting out demons. So we're the weird ones. Westerners are the weird ones. Like, what are 2% of the history of the world has not believed in supernatural forces at work, like demons and things like that. And most of those people are alive today. I mean, like, we're the weirdos in the Western world that don't accept this sort of thing. But let's just jump into it, Mike. What sort of things do you have in mind and might you have raised in those debates where you brought this up?
Well, the first I'd bring up would be well-evidenced near-death experiences. So, NDEs, near-death experiences. So there have been countless near-death experiences. Now, granted, most of those do not have any sort of corroborating data behind them. But some of them have that kind of data. There was a book that Gary Habermas recommended to me a few years ago, The Self Does Not Die. And it's got about 200 cases in there of people who have had near-death experiences or something very similar to it. Things that are very difficult to explain by natural causes. One of the most famous is Pamela Reynolds. And I think it was back in the 1980s, and she had something going on with her brain that required surgery. It's been a while since I've read her story, so I apologize. I don't have all the details down. But she required some kind of a brain surgery. And so they brought her into the operating room, and they rendered her unconscious. They put something in her ears, like these earplugs, and then they put headphones over her ears, and they pumped into it some sounds, clicking sounds at like 90 to 100 decibels. And like this one would have 90, this one would have 100, and then they'd switch them. And then they had her hooked up to an EKG and EEG, the EEG to record whether she had any kind of brain activity going on. And if she was hearing this stuff, there would be some brain activity that would register. So they rendered her unconscious. They stopped her heart. Then they drained the blood from her brain, from her head. And when she was put in the OR, there were all the surgical tools, and there were special tools for this kind of surgery. And there was a curtain in front of them. And Pamela said that when she died, when they stopped her heart, she came out of her body and she floated around the room. She saw the tools. She was able to describe them with pretty good, though not perfect, details. One, she said, yeah, there was this saw and it looked like an electric toothbrush. And yeah, it did. They asked her to draw it. She was able to repeat some of the conversations that were going on, like why did they put I don't know if it's a catheter, the catheter in her groin area during the surgery, or while she was rendered unconscious. And her eyes were taped shut. So they put a catheter in her groin area, and she said, well, why did you have to do that? She was able to recall details that I think one of the assistant surgeons made about her anatomy during the surgery. So, I mean, these things, they interviewed Michael Sabom, who's a cardiologist himself. He lives here, retired cardiologist. I've had lunch with him a couple of times. He lives here in the Atlanta area. And he went down and he interviewed these people. He interviewed the neurosurgeon who operated on her, interviewed nurse, several of the people. And yeah, they were able to corroborate these details. It's like, well, how do you get that? She's out of her body, having an out-of-body experience, and able to come back and recall these details, which it would have been impossible for her to have had she been in her body. How do you explain that? That's a well-evidenced one.
Before you move on from that, Mike, there's a couple of things to note there that I think are super impressive. First of all, that comment about where someone made a rude comment or an uncool comment about her. I remember Gary Habermas writing somewhere or saying in an interview that in Sabom's book, because I think is where a lot of that came from initially, was Sabom's book that he had compiled a lot of this information, and and he, like the copy that was sent to Habermas, if I remember this correctly, as a pre-release copy, had the story about the woman, about the guy making the rude comment that she heard. And then it wasn't in the final draft, but Habermas knew about it. And you've had lunch with him, and I'm sure you guys have discussed all this stuff. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was the clicking in the ears and the measuring. Do you understand what was just said? It was just, this is called Operation Standstill, I think they called it at the time, and where they lower the body temperature and drain the blood. And there are so many things here. It's often easy to say something like, well, maybe they weren't really unconscious, or the anesthesia didn't work, or their instruments weren't measuring something right. Okay, fine. But we have multiple reasons here why she shouldn't be hearing or seeing or thinking about any of this that's going on in the room while she's unconscious. And that is very powerful. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's another one. It's not one of the best ones, but it's one I find quite interesting. There was a mother, and she was in inpatient hospice. She's going to die at any moment. Her daughter's with her. She also had a son, and the father had died. Her husband had died, and she had a son with whom she was estranged. He had gotten into all sorts of trouble. He'd cost them a ton of money, and he had come into town because he wanted to see his mom one last time. And so he's talking to his sister, and the sister asked the mom whether she would see him. And she said no, she didn't want to see him. And he was just distraught. And so he was at he was at a bar across the street from the hospital. This is in that book, The Self Does Not Die, and which is written by two medical professionals. So he's in this bar, and he's crying, drinking at the bar, and he hears his voice. He hears his mom call his voice. And he stands up and he looks around, and he sees his mom at the front door. And she's walking toward him. And then some people, walk in front of her, and then she's gone. And so then at that very moment, the mom wakes up and she tells her daughter, I just had a strange dream. I was like at this bar, and so-and-so was up there crying, and I called his name, and he turned around, and then I woke up. And so just at that point, the physician came in, who was attending her, and the woman told the physician what had happened, and she was able to verify this with the son who had that experience. So there is something really weird, spiritual, that's going on. There's a spiritual dimension of reality, however you want to explain it, but it's very difficult to explain these things in materialistic terms.
And then it becomes anecdotal, but if you go to the average, so I used to travel and speak at churches, as you know, every week, Sunday through Wednesday, for 40 weeks out of the year or something. And I always would preach about heaven. And at a certain point where I preached about heaven, I would talk about one of the near-death experiences. And I would ask, now, if this seems outlandish to you, how many of you out here that are present either you yourself or someone has had something like this, where when they were slipping off into death, they began to describe something, or they had one of these kind of near-death experiences that are more veridical, or whatever. They saw a loved one or something like that, something that you believe was real, was real. And it'll be half the audience every time. And the interesting thing about it is I personally have that. My surrogate sister, we grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and my dad's secretary, who later became my secretary, was like a second mother to me. And her daughter was like a sister, like a big sister to me. And she died at about in her early 40s, about the age I am now. And when she died, she had asked to be taken off of any kind of anesthesia for the last several hours, like half a day, because she knew this was happening, this was coming, and she wanted to be lucid and be able to talk with her family. And so it's really touching. She said goodnight prayers with and read a story to her son, and then sent him to bed. And then later she died. But before she died, she said, and a good piece before she died, she said, "Do you all see this? Do you see it? What are you talking about?" She said, I just see this city over there, this city that I want to get to. Stuff like that. Everybody, I mean, Jonathan Pritchett, my co-host on Trinity Radio, one of our professors, he has stories like that when his dad died. And so people connect with this. If you personally haven't had an experience like this, don't dismiss it too quickly, because there are people out there who are listening and nodding their heads. Right, Mike?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The near-death experiences, I think it's really interesting. And, you know, if they're, all it takes is one really good, well-evidenced one, you know, with corroborating data. And there are plenty of those. But when you have so many of them, it just adds up, and each one of them presents a pretty good challenge against materialism and naturalism.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So near-death experiences. What other weird stuff are we going to talk about here, Mike?
Well, another one is what we could call veridical apparitions, some stuff that has some evidence, things that you can verify.
Are we talking about ghosts here, Mike?
You could call it a ghost, not necessarily, but possibly. Let me tell you the first time I heard about one. So when my family lived in Virginia Beach several years ago, we had a friend, Pat Ferguson, Doug and Pat Ferguson, good friends of ours, dear friends. They owned a kitchen remodeling place and did a number of things. And they, Pat told me a story that when she was a junior in high school, I believe it was, she had this friend, and she hadn't seen this friend, I think, since 8th grade. And this friend had gotten herself into trouble several times, I think drugs or something like that. But she'd gotten herself into trouble, and she hadn't seen her for a few years. And this one day, she was thinking about her quite a bit. So she goes to bed that night, and in the middle of the night, she is awakened. And she said she's on a bunk bed. She and her sister share the same bedroom, and she's in this bunk bed, and there are street lights that are outside that normally provide some illumination into the room at night. And so this one night she wakes up and the room is just totally dark, and she figures, well, I guess the street light burned out. And she closes her eye, and when she opens her eyes, she sees that the face, it's an illuminated face of this girl that she had been thinking about on the previous day, and that she hadn't seen in 3 years. And it just had this blank stare on her face. And it was like about 3 feet in front of her. And it really startled her. And she thought, what is this? And she closed her eyes, and she opened her eyes again. And when she did, she saw imposed behind that face was like the red face of the devil. And she described it to me. She said it was a red face. It had a wicked smile, and he had 2 horns coming up. I said, so you thought it was Satan? She said, that's how I interpreted it. And it had this wicked smile on its face, and it just really scared me. And I thought, I just must be dreaming. And I closed my eyes and opened them again, and they were there, just both of them looking at me. And I closed my eyes, and I'm biting my tongue, and I'm thinking I'm hallucinating, I'm dreaming, I got to wake up. And I open it, and they're still there. And I closed my eyes, and I did the only thing left I knew to do, and that was to pray the Lord's Prayer. And when I opened my eyes, the 2 faces were gone, and the street lights were on. Wow. I said, okay. She said, the next morning I came downstairs, and it was Easter Sunday, and I walked into the kitchen. My mom was making breakfast. My dad was reading the paper, and without saying a word, he put the paper down, flipped it around, pushed it toward me. I picked it up, and there was that girl that I had thought of the day before, that I saw in when I was wakened. And she was with some friends at a Login and Messina conference Saturday night. And they stayed after the conference. They went up to the top row, and there was a curtain behind. And apparently my friend thought that there was a wall behind the curtain, but there wasn't. and she leaned back and fell down 2 stories onto concrete. They took her to the hospital, and she died at 2:30 in the morning. She said, oh, and this is a detail I left out. When the light came back on and the faces were gone, I looked at the alarm clock and it was 2:30. So I'd heard this story and I thought, whoa, all right, veridical apparition. There was some evidence that she actually saw this because the time of death and things. So later on, after we moved down to the Atlanta metro area, I was talking to her and I said, hey, Pat, I tried to access the archives of the Virginian Pilot Ledger Star, the newspaper where this would have happened, and they don't go back that far. So could you go down there and see if you can find the archive and make a copy of it and send it to me? And she did. And there it was. And she had 2 details wrong, though, remembering it several decades later. 2 details wrong. Number one, it wasn't the morning after that, she was awake at 2:30. It wasn't that morning, just a few hours later. It couldn't have been, because if she died at 2:30, there's no way that's going to make it into the morning paper, right? And so she had looked on that Sunday, and it wasn't Sunday, it was in Monday's paper. So that was one error in her memory recall. The second was, if I remember this correctly, she said it was on Easter, but it ended up being Palm Sunday. So, I mean, they're simple errors in memory, but other than that, decades later, she had everything correct. And it's like, whoa. So that's a veridical apparition. And there have been many of these.
What do you make, though, before we go on, Mike, out of things like, I imagine like a skeptic listening to this and saying something like, okay, well, man, I'm with you until you have a red devil with horns. That seems a little bit like Chick Track, like cartoon like. What do you? How does that affect you when you hear that? Because it is a powerful story, but when I'm dragging my comb through it, that's the only part that hangs me up a little bit. Not that it couldn't still be true just like that, but I'm just wondering what your take on that part was.
Yeah, to be honest with you, Braxton, I had a little trouble with that at first too. It's kind of embarrassing, but I mean, it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, that's what she saw. That's what she saw. She recalled everything, except those 2 minor details with great accuracy. Decades later, the corroborating, evidence for it. So I don't know how you explain it. Maybe was that actually the girl? Was it actually Satan? Was it a hologram? That
was it
a
demonic force manifesting in a way that would be frightening to the young girl? Perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we just don't have the playbook for that kind of stuff. Yeah. But that doesn't at all explain away the evidence.
It doesn't. It's more of a thing of, I did want to ask you what you thought about it, but more noting it for people that are going to be like, hold on a second. I think it's relevant to point out that to Christians too, it's like, okay, but still the evidence is there for an interesting evidence for a powerful experience. So Dale Allison, now what were you going to say about Dale?
Okay. He's a friend of mine. He's one of the top New Testament scholars in the world. I've said this several times, but, and Greg Manette, my friend, said it to me once, and I agree with him. If you were to poll the top New Testament scholars in the world, just say those that the 400 or so members of the Society for New Testament Studies, and you'd say, who would you say are your top 5 New Testament scholars alive today? I think Dale Allison's name would appear on that list more than any others. He is just really sharp. I mean, he's not a conservative New Testament scholar, not an evangelical, but he's brilliant. I don't agree with him on everything, but I mean, he's brilliant. He's written some great stuff. He just came out with a new book, Encountering Mystery, where he talks about some of the stuff he has experienced. He himself has experienced veridical apparitions, things where an apparition appears to him, and I think it was his dad, and said, "Hey, go tell someone, wish them happy birthday for me today." And so he thought, well, that's weird. And so he calls his dad's friend to wish him a happy birthday, and it turned out it was their birthday.
Wow.
So it's like all kinds of stuff. He saw, I think her name was Barbara. She had died, I believe, in a car, car wreck, and she appeared to him years later. Some of these are veridical, some not. But I mean, we're not just talking about, goofball kind of people. We're talking about intelligent people, highly educated people,
of course,
respectable people who have experienced these veridical apparitions. These aren't necessarily rare. I mean, there are a lot of people who have these, and these, just like well-evidenced near-death experiences, those that have corroborating data, veridical apparitions pose a serious challenge to materialism, to naturalism.
Right on. Okay. So I'm tempted, obviously, each time, Mike, to want to spend 45 minutes talking about each thing you raise. But in the interest of moving things along, what else you got?
Well, I think you've got some paranormal phenomena. Okay. I've experienced some of that myself. I'm sorry, my voice is cracking here. I don't know why, but
no, that's okay. That's fine.
So paranormal phenomena, I mean, I've experienced some things. I'll just give you one incident I had, but I've had several. So during the late 1970s and throughout until probably the mid 1980s, my dad had a ministry. He had been in the Masonic Lodge, the Shriners. And when he became a Christian, he started feeling a little guilty about being in that. And so he started looking into its background, and he found that the two guys who founded the Masonic Lodge, I think Mackey and Pike, they had borrowed some stuff and dabbled in the occult. And so he was going around to churches and on Christian radio, even appeared on the John Ankerberg show once or twice, and saying that Christians should not be involved in Freemasonry and the Shriners. And Braxton, I kid you not, before he would go on a major program, television, radio, or in a larger church, our house would become haunted. It's just really strange. I mean, doors would slam shut for no apparent reason. My parents, they both, I never experienced this, but my parents would sometimes in the middle of the night would look over at the entrance to their bedroom and they'd see someone standing in the doorway. My dad would normally see a large man. My mom once saw a large man with his arms crossed. Another occasion, she saw the silhouette of a woman wearing a very elaborate dress. And I was like, man, that's weird. And they would just pray, or they'd say, in the name of Jesus, I command you to leave. And it would be gone. It would just vanish.
No priest?
One time for me.
No priest required? No priest required?
Yeah. So one time I was home from college or grad school, I don't remember which. And I think it was for Thanksgiving break. And so I would typically go out at night and, just walk around. There was a baseball field near my house in Baltimore. And I'd go there. It was across from a giant grocery store. They have a chain there called Giant. And so because of the parking lot being lit up, some of that light carried over to the baseball field. So your eyes adjust and you can see, but I doubt that anyone could see me. And this particular night, it's probably half a mile from my house. And this particular night, I just felt like in just a wonderful mood for worship. And at one point, I am just laying on the ground and praying and singing hymns to the Lord and just worshiping. And in a little bit of the distance, I heard footsteps coming toward me. And I thought, I'm just going to ignore it. It's probably just someone walking their dog, and maybe they see me here and they're laying on the ground and they wonder if I'm okay. And the footsteps kept getting closer. I would say at first, maybe 50 yards away. That'd just be my guess. And so when they kept approaching me, I looked up and they stopped, and there was no one around. Thought, it's just the wind blowing the leaves or something. And I put my head down and start praying and worshiping, and the footsteps start coming toward me again. And I thought, I wonder. And I look up and they stop. And then I start praying again, and they start coming toward, and I look up and I'm thinking, all right, I know what this is. I'm pretty sure this is kind of some of the spooky, perhaps demonic stuff that my mom and dad and some of us experienced in the house. And I put my head down one more time, and it's like these things are within 10 yards, and they're running toward me, and that just spooked me, and I got up and I ran home. So, I mean, these kinds of things. My dad had he had the bigger stories, but boy, I have to admire him. He got to a point where, he would just allow it to go around him, and he wouldn't allow it to faze him. But man, it spooked me. And it's probably only within maybe the last 5 years that if I were alone in my house at night, that I would not have a night light on just outside the bedroom, wow. Because it still spooked me up until about 5 years ago. So, I mean, that stuff is, paranormal phenomena, that's just my own personal experience and my family.
Well, I'm fascinated by your personal experience. So don't move on real quick. I want to know, how confident are you? Because you're known for being very open and honest about your credences. So how confident are you that happened?
Oh, high 90 percentile.
Okay. Yeah. How confident are you that there were footsteps coming towards you, however there were footsteps?
Yeah, I'd say high 90 percentile.
Wow.
I mean, there are plenty of things for which I have doubts and less confidence, but yeah, I'd say high 90 percentile. I don't see myself hallucinating that or just imagining that. That was very, very real. Now, I don't expect a skeptic to take that and say, well, I should listen to that. Licona's just a quack. After all, he's a Christian, right? He believes in all this supernatural stuff. But, right. Once you experience this kind of stuff, you know it's true. And,
okay,
it's not just me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I've got a friend who lives in the Houston area, Gary Hamrick. He used to be in Hawaii. And in Maui, he was an evangelism pastor. He's got all kinds of demonic stories. One that I told during my debate with Matt was a friend of mine, Kim Earhart. She, I don't know where she lives now. It was either Indiana or Michigan. I met her years ago. We kind of stayed in touch every once in a while on Facebook. But she told me how when she was a junior in high school, another junior in high school, when she was a junior in high school, she was dating this guy very seriously. They had planned to get married upon graduating from high school. And she and her boyfriend and another couple were down in her basement playing on a Ouija board on Halloween during her junior year of high school. And the Ouija board said that her boyfriend would be decapitated that day. And all of them are laughing, but she's not laughing. She says, no, this isn't funny. Look, my mom's a witch. My grandmother was a witch. I've dabbled in the witchcraft. This stuff isn't anything to laugh at. And they just kept laughing. And so she just insisted they pack up the Ouija board, put it away. And then they went to dinner. They were going to McDonald's. And so she insisted that she drive and they take an alternate route there. And so they did, and nothing happened that day. And, but the next year on Halloween, her and her boyfriend planned to meet for dinner and he didn't show up. And so she goes to where he was working. He was working on a crew where they were putting branches into a wood chipper, taking down trees and putting it in a wood chipper. And she found that day, a branch caught his arm and pulled him into the wood chipper up to his neck, and it decapitated him.
Wow.
So that was weird. And then a few years later, she got together with some other friends because now she really missed him and she wanted to communicate with him in the afterlife, in the spirit world. And so they got the Ouija board out again. And as they're trying to communicate, this time they're in the kitchen, and they had a metal trash can in there, a small metal trash can with a metal lid. And she said, as they're trying to communicate with him, the lid on that trash can just kind of lifted up and hovered in the air. And then it like threw itself on the wall. And rather than bouncing off the wall, it like went flat on the wall. And then she said it was like a hand was guiding it down to the floor. It went down to the floor and then came off and was spinning like a coin. And it just terrified them. And so they got up and ran out. And I said, do you think your friends still remember? And she says, I don't know. Let's find out. So within like an hour or two, she's sending me screenshots where she had texted them. One was in prison, so she couldn't communicate with him. But the other two, they said that they remembered it. And so it was, wow. I mean, these things happen. These are legitimate experiences. They really
Mike,
occur.
I have a podcast that I keep talking about that we're going to release, a new podcast, not Trinity Radio, that's only going to be 6 episodes, limited series, and maybe we'll do it again later, but it's on just this kind of thing. People sharing their supernatural experiences. And we have a girl named Ashley who is going to be the first one. In fact, I've already released a little stuff with Ashley, but she has had several type of experiences, most notably with a Ouija board. And she put her story was she put her hand on the planchet, or whatever you call the thing that moves around the board, and her friend wanted her to look away and put her hand on it so that they could do this and she would know there was no trickery, because the friend didn't believe. And it spelled out, I don't remember how it all worked, but it spelled out that this girl asked it. She wanted to know, how did my uncle die? Because there's no way that this girl with the Ouija board knew how her uncle died. And without her looking, and only the friend who's the skeptic looking, it spelled out drowned, and he had drowned. And so the girl basically was like, don't ever bring that thing to my house again, and was freaked out by it, as I think a lot of people would be. And so when you say they're not, that these are not uncommon, I asked on Facebook for people who had supernatural experiences to reach out to me. And I got so many people willing to give interviews about it that I could never do them all. They're everywhere. And like you say, sure, paupers, beggars, but also academicians and people in STEM fields and philosophers. So interesting stuff. I really like hearing these kind of stories, and I really liked hearing your personal story that you had. That's always really powerful.
Well, thanks. These things, they just, you start to look at these things and you say, reality is far more complex than atheists think. And it seems like there is certainly some really good evidence for a spiritual dimension of reality. And this is really strong background information in which something like a resurrection of Jesus is entirely at home, right? If you're saying, well, people just don't rise from the dead. Well, no, not the average person. But if Jesus was the divine Son of God, well, that's a game changer. And now all bets are off. And guess what? This kind of stuff, the spiritual stuff, the supernatural stuff, this isn't as foreign to reality as many people would think. This is very common stuff. And, Craig
but Mike,
Keener
it could be explained too. The supernatural stuff, sure, maybe that's real, but it could be explained by Islam or Hinduism or it's not specific to Christianity. What would you say to that?
Say, yeah, you're right. And I, just like arguments for God's existence doesn't zero in on Christianity either. But it
does mean naturalism's false.
That's right. I can check that one off and say, well, that's not the correct worldview. So let's find something else. And then you start to compare some of these other things. And look, you do apologetics, I do apologetics. I think we'd be the first to be honest, to be open and admit we don't have the answers to everything. There are some things that are confusing. Like, for example, near-death experiences. people in heaven don't just happen to Christians. They happen to people of other faiths as well. Yet that doesn't seem to bode correct with what's taught in the New Testament about the exclusivity claims of Christ. Now, there are perhaps some decent ways of explaining that. But, I don't have the answer to everything. But what I do, I see, okay, I don't think atheism is true, because it's not very compatible with this kind of stuff we're discussing right now. All right, now I compare Christianity with Islam, with Hinduism, with Buddhism, and it seems like we have a whole lot more going for Christianity in terms of supporting evidence than we have for any of these other religions, any of them. So yeah, I think that I am rationally justified in embracing Christianity and interpreting some of these spiritual experiences in light of the Christian worldview.
And it kind of works the other way too. For example, like you said, if we were making it up, if all this was being fabricated, perhaps we would craft a story where the Christians always end up going to heaven and everybody else ends up having the hellish experience. And like you say, Christians have responses to why we might see these in near-death experiences, but that's kind of, one might think it's a point against us, but in another sense, in another domain, it's kind of a point in favor. We're not trying to make this up. We're trying to deal with the data that we have, even when it's not comfortable with our position.
Yeah, I agree with you. Then we've got radically answered prayer. That's another one that we can add to this. I mean, no, let's face it. Most answered prayer isn't something that we look at and say, well, we know that God answered prayer. So say I get on a plane and fly to Houston and I pray, God, get me there safely, and I land safely. Did God answer prayer? Well, maybe he knew that an engine or two were going to go out, or maybe there was going to be a terrorist making their way onto the plane and God thwarted that. I don't know. Or let's just say I pray that I get a job. Someone prays they get a job and they get the job. Is it because God gave them the job, or is it because they were the best candidate applying for it? Well, it could be that God gave it to them, but it could also be that, they were the best candidate. You're just not going to know. Most answered prayers are that way. But there are other answered prayers that really get your attention a whole lot more. Like I have a friend, I haven't spoke with him in years, but his name's Loy Reed. He's probably in his 70s right now. And Loy used to be the director of collegiate ministries for the Florida Baptist Convention. And in June of 1987, Loy got in a car accident, terrible car accident. He was driving from, I believe, Alabama back to Florida, and it was, early in the morning, and he could hardly keep his eyes open. So he pulled the car over to the shoulder, turned the lights off, went to sleep, and a drunk driver didn't see and was veering off the road and slammed into the back. And anyway, Loy was in a coma for weeks. And so then July 4th, 1987 comes around. Loy's still in a coma in the hospital, and miles away, a bunch of people from his church were celebrating the 4th of July with a church picnic. And at 4:00 in the afternoon, they got together to pray for Loy. And at 4:00 in the afternoon, miles away in the hospital, Loy came out of his coma after being in it for 3 weeks. And it gets better. Before midnight, everyone else that was in that same room had been in a coma for no less than a month, and some as much as 6 months. And every one of them came out of their coma by the end of that night.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty cool stuff.
That is awesome.
Radically answered prayer. And so there's plenty of those.
Like God walked through the room or something.
Exactly.
So
I mean, one that boy, what's one that I could pick that I've had? So I don't remember. I think it was 1988, and the Lord had impressed on me that in the spring, the fall of 1988, and the Lord had impressed on me that He was going to do something very special through through my ministry in the spring. And so he impressed it on me to fast and pray about this. I hate fasting. Haven't done it for a long time either. But so I hate fasting, but I felt like God was telling me, it's weird. I didn't hear a voice. I just felt this like crystal clear impression that I was to fast and pray for a while because God was going to do something. And so the spring came, I did, and then the spring came and I had several speaking engagements, and it's like, well, nothing, really happened and special, So then I was to speak at a senior high retreat for senior high school students for the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, which is a moderate to liberal denomination. And so I was there, and I gave a lecture breakout session. I was the keynote speaker. I was the main speaker for that weekend, and I was doing apologetic stuff. So Saturday afternoon, I spoke on the exclusivity claims of Christ. Oh man, the youth leaders there, several of them just blasted me, and they're doing this in front of the students. And I'm thinking, whoa. So then I'm talking about apologetics, and then Saturday night, I do something on the resurrection. And then Sunday morning, before I'm to speak, I got ready, and I'm ready to go up to breakfast, and I'm just out walking on the camp grounds, and I'm praying. And I feel like God says, I want you to give an invitation. An invitation? Lord, these are Presbyterians. You don't give invitations to Presbyterians. No, give an invitation. I didn't hear a voice, but I just felt this impression. It was like really crystal clear. I was to give an invitation. And I'm like battling with the Lord. And it's like, I don't want to do that. Besides, these people, the leaders hate me. And if no one does anything, I'm toast. There's something I forgot to tell you though. Friday night, this was Sunday morning, but Friday night, before I was to go up and speak the first time, one of the youth leaders pointed out a girl out in the hall crying, one of the students. And she said, would you go speak with her? She just got news. Her grandfather had open heart surgery today, and he's not doing well. They're expecting him to die. So I said, okay. So I went out in the hall and talked with her, prayed with her, and then I spoke that night. Saturday morning, I saw her and I said, hey, any news on your grandfather? Yeah, they said he's gotten worse. They don't expect him to last the day. So I said, okay. So then Saturday afternoon, after I gave my lecture on the exclusivity claims of Christ, I'm walking through a ball field on the camp grounds, and this girl and two other guys are walking toward me, and we're going to pass. And when I saw her, I said, have you heard anything else from your grandfather? She said, no. And so I said, okay, hey, why don't we just pray for him? And she said, what, now? I said, yeah, why don't we just sit down here on the ball field and all of us can just pray for him? They just looked at each other like this was just really strange. And so we did. They prayed, I prayed. It's like half an hour later, she comes running up to me and saying, Mr. Mike, my grandfather just called. He said, were you praying for me? And I said, yeah. He said, I felt like I was going to die until about half an hour ago. So this goes all around now, and everybody's like talking about this on the campgrounds, and people say, hey, would you pray for me? And hey, it's not me. I'm not special or anything. It's God. So anyway, Sunday morning comes, God's impressing on me to give an invitation. So I do. And one of the youth leaders got saved. So
wow.
1 month later, let me just wrap this up. One month later, I'm supposed to do the same retreat, but for the junior high the middle school students. And in the meantime, one of the students went home, told her mom, who was a pastor, that I had said that Jesus is the only way. And so that pastor complained to the presbytery of the PCUSA, and they tried to get me nixed from speaking at the next conference. Well, when I didn't get a call ahead of time, I got there to the conference, I arrived, and a guy came up, he identified as one of the presbyters, and he said, we got complaints, and he started asking me some questions. Do you think Jesus is the only way? Yes. Well, that is what the good book says. That's what he said. I said, yeah, it is. He said, well, we had reports that you said that the Jews were responsible for crucifying Jesus. And I said, yes, the Jewish leadership, the temple leadership, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they were the ones responsible for it. And I said, even Josephus says that. He says the leading men among us had him.
Like, you do understand,
said,
I'm doing this as a historian. I'm doing historiography here.
Yeah.
Well, I guess at that time,
he said,
maybe
well,
not.
that is history. He said, okay, you're good. They tried to get you banned, but I approve it. So everything's, going well for the weekend. Some of the same youth pastors were there. I could tell that they disdained me. Anyway, Sunday morning comes, and guess what? I'm taking a walk praying in the morning, and I feel God impressing it upon me in clearest terms. Give an invitation. Oh, Lord, I don't want to. I've never done these before. It's like, I don't want to do this. And give an invitation. All right, Lord, well, I'm not going to make it easy. So I give my last talk on Sunday morning, and then I say, okay, I don't tell anyone to bow their heads, close their eyes, nothing. I said, look, there are some of you here. I know you're junior high, middle school students, but you've got involved in sex and drugs. And you're saying, you know what? I made a profession for Christ years ago, but I haven't lived it. And I want to change my life. I want to give my life over to Christ and rededicate myself. And there are others. And by the way, one of the worship leaders was a lesbian atheist at this retreat. There are others here who are not believers. And now you've looked at the evidence and you say, you know what? The evidence is pointing to Christianity. And now I want to give my life to Christ. I want to follow Jesus. I said, if you are in either of those categories, I want you to stand up right now and come forward. And Braxton, there was no hesitation. Out of about 120 students, about 80 of them stood up and came forward. Yeah. And I looked at one of the youth pastors, and she was like, wow. And I'm thinking, all right, Lord, this is why you impressed on me to fast and pray. It's like,
yeah,
this is pretty cool. So, I mean, there are some really cool answers to prayer that happen.
Dude, it's like, I'm sorry, but our culture is in such in the toilet right now. And I'm sitting here hearing about that kind of a minister of the gospel. And I'm thinking to myself, what you're doing is you have people here who are dying, and you've got an injection that will save them. The injection is not the injections we've been talking about for the past 2 years. The injection is Christianity. And you're going up to them and you're saying, now this is a great injection, but don't feel like you have to do this injection. There's all these other injections. And you're coming along going, yeah, but those other injections are just sugar water. They do nothing, or they're just blank or whatever. And they're like, yeah, but we don't want to force anything on anyone. And you're standing up saying, listen, I don't know quite how to explain this, but God told me to tell every one of you that this is the only one that works. And 80 people take it. It's like, what is going on that the ministers of the gospel who are supposed to be preaching and sharing this can't bring themselves to repeat the words that Jesus himself said about who he was and that he was the way. It's bothering me, because on the one hand, I'm shocked about some of the things that are going on in our culture, that people are not shouting from the rooftops about it. But at the very least, people who purport to be ministers of the gospel, it's very frustrating. But in the midst of that, the light shined because you were willing to listen to God. I love that.
Yeah, thanks, man. And by the way, I want to correct, it was 1998, not 88. Braxton, I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words apply for us today. He called it a cheap grace, where you just kind of pray a prayer and then just go on living your life as though that takes care of it. I noticed that when the rich man came to Jesus and said, hey, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He says, well, you know the commandments. Yeah, I've done all these things. Okay, you lack one thing. Sell everything you have, give to the poor, come follow me, and you'll have riches in heaven. And the guy couldn't do it. He was grieved because he was wealthy and he didn't want to do that. So he walked away. Jesus, what came to me later on was like, Jesus, notice what he did not do. He didn't stop the guy and say, look, hey, discipleship takes a while. You grow into it. Just come back, kneel before me, pray this prayer to me, and at least get heaven taken care of for right now. He let the guy walk. And it's like here in the West, in the U.S., we just say, hey, just pray this prayer, and now you have eternal life. And I think it's more than that.
It's certainly, that's definitely
he's
a
calling
good
for
caution.
disciples.
to make. It's the reality is you need to understand it. With the whole thing recently that's been going on with Dr. Craig, we're not going to get into that, but Dr. William Lane Craig, a part of the discussion that's been happening between the atheist community on YouTube and him centers around what it costs, or sprang from what it costs to live the Christian life. There are heavy costs, and those will seem heavier, as you and I were talking before the show, I think, or maybe on the show, depending on where you are and what century it is or decade. It'll be worse for some than others, or depending on what your proclivities are, the sacrifice may seem to be higher than for others. But yes, we don't at all want to present the notion that saying a series of words makes you a Christian and there's nothing else required.
Well, let's face it, even here in the United States, if you hold views that go against the elite today and the leftists, there are people who are losing their jobs. Losing jobs, losing contracts, they're being ostracized from wherever. I think we're very close to a time when standing up for your Christian faith. I mean, look, you just taken a stance to say, look, same-sex marriage is the law of the land, but I still think it's immoral. You can get yourself in trouble for expressing such a view. And people are silent about that. A lot of people are silent about that at work because they're fearful of what can happen. Look how social media cancels you, Twitter, Facebook, and cancels you if you come out with statements of truth, of what you believe and your opinions on things. I mean,
or your kid, or what happens if your child says, I think it's a boy, and says, I think I'm a girl, and I want to talk to someone about gender affirming therapies or something. I think there already have been ramifications for some people that have said, no, that's not what that means, that you have that feeling right now or something. I think there have been ramifications for some parents about that. And we can see that getting worse. So basically what Mike is saying is true, because I'm telling you that when I was in the youth group in the 90s, I would have been at the camp Mike was speaking at, not really, but I wouldn't have been at that PCSA camp. But, I was in that age bracket, and I can tell you right now, the stuff that our youth pastors said that we all cringe at as part of culture, like, oh, that's what a youth pastor would say. Yeah, it's what they would say, because it's the major stuff you're going to face. A lot of the stuff they decried is stuff that you can ruin your life very early with sex and drugs and alcohol. And that's why they talk about it, because we allow you to start using those things at exactly the age where you're most likely to abuse them or use them wrongly and ruin your life. And so we're just living in a time where all the things that I saw, and the preachers saying what's going to happen. Jonathan Pritchett says all the time that preachers would say things about the sexual stuff that's going on now 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And we thought, yeah, okay, he's going to say that. We're seeing it now. It's happened. And so what's it going to be like in the next 30 years? You're absolutely right. Christians better be prepared to face some level of persecution, even if it doesn't mean the type of persecution that some Christians have experienced in the past.
Yeah. I think we need to be prepared for it, prepare ourselves for it as well. You either speak out or prepare yourselves in the near future to be persecuted. I think it's coming. And may be good for the church. The church seems to thrive more and be more healthy, and it weeds out the pretenders. So
it's one of those places where if that's what God wants, then great. But man, I hope we can stave that off. Any of us with kids probably feel that way, but God's will, not ours.
Amen. I'm with you on that, brother.
So you got anything else, Mike?
I mean, there's plenty of other examples, but I think those four things you're looking at: well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, paranormal phenomena, and extreme answers to prayer. I think those so strongly support a supernatural or spiritual dimension of reality that once you really consider the evidence, it's very difficult to deny a spiritual dimension of reality and still think of yourself as a realist.
One story that you've told, Mike, and I think you did bring out in that debate, maybe not in your openings, on extreme answered prayer. I actually made a video where I played you telling this somewhere, but you were talking about a guy who was an atheist who sent you an email explaining about some church needed money, and somebody's cashier or some kind of savings bonds have matured or something. I don't know. Tell that one, because I found that very interesting. I found it so interesting this guy's still an atheist after that.
Yeah. So I remember his name's, I didn't mention his name when I tell the story for years, because, I mean, he said it in an email to me, but then later on his website, he actually mentioned it. So his name's Luke. And, you know, I haven't seen any of the stuff I don't know if he's still doing stuff. Maybe he is. I don't even remember the name of his, you know, podcast, Pale Blue Dot, something like that. But in our email exchange after I was interviewed, he said something about challenging on the supernatural. And I said, you know, look, you know, if you were a believer, you would have experienced some of this stuff. And so he said, well, I used to be a believer. And then he proceeds to tell me the story about his dad was, I think, a deacon in a church. And the church was really suffering financially. It's a small church, and it was really suffering financially, and they needed some money. They needed it immediately. And so they had a prayer meeting with people there at the church, and they prayed. And they said, we need this specific amount. And it's like the very next day or something like that, in the mail was a check for that exact amount. And they called the woman, and they said, well, what made you give this? She said, well, you know, years ago, I visited your church. She hadn't been gone since. Years ago, I visited your church, and the Lord impressed upon me to put some money aside in an annuity to give to you at a later time.
Wow.
And I just felt like it was time. And she had no idea they had the need, but it was to the very penny of what they needed. And he said, see, so I've seen these things. And so really, there's just no evidence for God's existence. What? What? What do you need?
Do you hear yourself? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Luke, if you hear this, yeah, it looks like it's Pale Blue Dot. I looked it up. So, yeah, interesting. Well, Mike, I sure have enjoyed having you on. This has been a blast, brother. And I always feel like I'm hanging out with a friend. I think, this is easily in the top 2 or 3 most enjoyable shows I've ever filmed with someone I'm interviewing. I mean, usually I'm a little nervous.
Thanks, man.
This has felt like I'm hanging out with a friend talking about really cool stuff. And I feel like I've been to church, man. And listen.
Oh, yeah. We are good friends, brother.
Well, good. Well, listen, let me just say this to anyone listening. We've been talking all about it, but if you want to know the Lord Jesus Christ, then you want to know what it is that we are experiencing that we say is so great, then there's not a magic set of words that you say and that makes you saved. But if you're ready to walk away from the life without Jesus to a life with Jesus, walk away from whatever you might have done that we would call sinful to a life with Jesus, doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. We'll all make mistakes, but the goal is to live for the Lord and to do what he wants. And if that's what you want, and you understand Jesus and you understand who he is, the Bible says in Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is the Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. And I think it's meaningful and appropriate for you to pray a prayer and just tell the Lord that you believe that and you repent of your sins and you're ready to turn from your life without him to a life with him. And then reach out to us. You can reach out to me at braxton@trinityradio.org, and I'd be happy to try and help you find a way to get plugged into a church somewhere nearby. But we definitely want to hear about that. It'll be the most important decision you ever make. Mike, it's been awesome. Thanks so much. Check out Mike at Risen Jesus and check out his YouTube channel. It's all linked in the description. And get ready to buy that new popular level book on the Gospels, but make sure you get the big one on the resurrection and the Gospels. Anything else you need to say, Mike?
No, Braxton, as always, it's just wonderful to spend some time with you, my friend.
All right. And we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.